I think one of the most interesting arenas in this war, which is Iraq. They don't want to be dragged into this, but the Iranians are firing to Iraq, firing on the Kurds, firing on other targets. Can you make sense of this? I mean, where is this going?
If you effectively empower militias who are currently trying to kill our personnel, as they are currently trying to kill US personnel, then we will regard that as a hostile act. And of course the Americans have taken kinetic action against the militias in Iraq, and I don't know whether Israel's been involved in those operations, but certainly the Americans have done it. So I think that the Iraqis will be very careful. They will know, again, that same question arises, doesn't it, which is the Islamic Republic going to survive? And do I actually want to back that horse if that horse is going to lose? So the Iraqis, I think, will try to produce some kind of safe political outcome that enables them to wait out the conflict and see what things look like afterwards.
איזה אפקט זה עושה על החוסן של מדינת ישראל?
ולמה דווקא אנחנו נמצאים פה?
ללא היהדות אין שום זכות קיום לישראל.
אין דבר כזה מוסריות בשדה הקרב.
מספיק עם התמימות הזאת. ההיסטוריה הרי לא משקרת. ישראל חייבת להיות מסוגלת להגן על עצמה בכוחות עצמה.
שלום לכולם וברוכים המצטרפים שוב. אני אציין קודם כל שאנחנו מקליטים ביום רביעי, אנחנו 18 למרץ, זה חשוב להגיד כי הדברים פה משתנים לפעמים אפילו לפי שעה. והיום הזמנו לאולפן אורח מיוחד במינו, זה אדם בעל קליבר בינלאומי, אני אציג אותו תכף באנגלית, זה יהיה פרק מיוחד באנגלית, אנחנו לפעמים נעשה פרקים באנגלית, זה מאפשר לנו להרחיב קצת את המוזמנים, את הפרספקטיבות ולקבל באמת אנשים בעלי שיעור קומה מכל רחבי העולם. אז היום יש לי כבוד עצום להזמין את האורח שלנו להיום, אדמונד פיטון-בראון, אתן לכם קצת רקע לגביו. אז היום, Edmund Fitton-Brown is a senior fellow at FDD. He's focused on Arabian Peninsula issues as well as terrorism and its enablers. He served in the past in the UK Foreign Service in Finland, Egypt, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Italy, and the United Arab Emirates, and he was the ambassador to Yemen, which is, I think, the most fascinating, maybe, of course, it's all interesting. So you're an expert on the Arab world. You've spent so many years in the region as a diplomat, also as a researcher. You're an expert on Islamic extremism and terrorism. And I wanted to kind of, first of all, I want to thank you. I said thank you already in Hebrew. I don't know if you understand or not, but I want to thank you in person because I know your time is precious and it's amazing that you took the time to be here today. Thank you, Edmund.
Well, thank you. And with apologies, I don't speak Hebrew, so I hadn't been able. I think there are some very small similarities or relationships between Hebrew and Arabic. So occasionally I will come across something which I recognize as an Arabic word or a word similar to Arabic. But it's great to be with you.
Thank you so much. If you don't mind, I wanna use your expertise and your experience in the region to kind of walk you through the craziness as we view it, at least as Israelis. I mean, we are used to being on the front line of the war against terrorism, on the war against Iran. But what we're not used to is seeing so many other countries in the region and beyond being dragged into this. And I think it's interesting to kind of dive into their experience, why they are reacting or not reacting as much as we would have thought, and the domestic intricacies of the domestic politics and so on and so forth, and how you see things progress. But before we dive into the Arab world, if you don't mind, because you spent so much time in the Foreign Office in the UK, and you understand also obviously Europe and the European mindset. We're also kind of puzzled, I guess, in some respects. I mean, we're used to seeing the European taking an approach of appeasement and de-escalation. We're very critical of the fact that they would, as far as we're concerned, not willing to stand up for themselves. And how do you see this? I mean, Trump has called NATO to come and join his efforts, at least in protecting the Straits of Hormuz. No response or negative response so far from the main European countries. Can you walk us through a little bit, I mean, how you see things and why it's happening this way?
Well, I mean, of course, this is a war which the US and Israel have launched. And so it does put other parties in a difficult position because, other parties will have different calculations, may have different legal considerations. When I look at the Israeli reason for doing this, I find it absolutely compelling, and I completely support Israel in this campaign. But you're doing this for reasons of existential threat. In the case of the US, I think also their reasons are very good and very strong, but Trump is operating in a way which is unusual in American history. Ignoring any other sort of stakeholders to do what he judges to be the right thing to do, and not really communicating in all cases the desired outcomes from the war, because this is another point in which Trump is very unusual as a leader. Again, I'm not saying he's wrong. I think he may well be right in this, but the problem is that when you're trying to engage diplomatically or in coordination with the states, you're actually hearing completely contradictory desired end states sometimes from different members of the administration and sometimes from Trump himself on different occasions. And so you can well imagine that if you're sitting in Berlin or in London, or indeed, of course, Seoul and Tokyo, because the Koreans and the Japanese have also ruled themselves out from doing something in the Strait of Hormuz. It's very difficult because if you're going to go to war, you've got to sell it to your people and explain it, and that's the respect in which a much more steady communication from the United States would have helped. All of that said, I think there is a disappointing lack of resolution about the West the wider West in this area, and I think that the Germans, for example, have managed that much better than the British. The Germans have also said they won't help in the Strait. If you send a ship into the Strait of Hormuz at the moment, it's quite likely it's going to get hit by the Iranians. And then are you in a state of war with Iran? It's a sort of a thin end of the wedge in a way, and that's why I think you see this element of caution. But what the Germans have done is they've made a number of other gestures and statements that have been very much in solidarity with Israel and the United States, and they've been tough on the IRGC. The Europeans have proscribed the IRGC as a terrorist organization. The Germans didn't go down that idiotic path of recognizing a Palestinian state. Yeah. So I think from a Washington DC perspective, people look at Germany and say, well, they can't give us everything we want, but they are trying. And what I have been advising the British government is that at the moment, you don't look like you're trying. You don't look like you're being useful at all. You did this stupid thing over recognition of Palestine. You can't seem to summon up the resolution to proscribe the IRGC or the Houthis, for example, as terrorist organizations. And then, so when you then say you can't help in the Strait of Hormuz, that really looks like a sort of, like you're just saying no on everything. So I think there's a really poor communication issue and strategic issue with the Keir Starmer government here. And of course, they're making political calculations, I think, which is that this would be unpopular with their electorate. But in my view, by if you like, sort of showing that kind of weakness, first of all, they're going to alienate traditional allies. And secondly, they're not going to make themselves popular with their Muslim constituency, for whom nothing is ever enough. And so, they won't be satisfied. They'll still say that, oh, you're still supporting the Israelis and the Americans in other ways. So it's a pointless exercise to try to placate that constituency. And in my view, and I have given this advice to the British government, they ought to have taken a forward position on this. In the way that they did at the time of the deployment to the Red Sea to combat the Houthi attacks on commercial shipping when the UK took a partnership role, a junior partnership role with the Americans in trying to keep shipping going through the Red Sea. In my view, they should have done the same with the Strait of Hormuz. They should have very quickly said to the Americans, yeah, you know, a challenge to this waterway is against international law, and we're prepared to send whatever ships we have available that can do the job to help out. So I think the UK has been weak, and I think it's been indecisive, and I think it'll probably try to play catch up now. It'll realize that it's got a problem in various ways. So, for example, you know, the British are coming to the assistance of the Arabian Peninsula Arab states because they're being attacked, and the UK has a traditional relationship with them, and it can provide a certain amount of help. But it all feels like it's too little too late.
Yes, I agree with you. By the way, I also marveled, I have to say. I mean, maybe it's not enough, but I marveled at how the German authorities have started to deal with, you know, their own Iranian domestic threats during the last 2 years. Even the terrorism threats, Hezbollah, Hamas, they've really understood, seemed like, you know, also from my conversations with various German, you know, senior in different authorities, that they understand the threat of Iran, of Iranian proxies, and they're trying to do, you know, more than ever to deal with these threats domestically. So I'm kind of surprised that the Germans are not even, you know, more cooperative on this. When it comes to the UK or France, they just now designated the RJC, just now, after, it also took a little bit of time after the bloodshed in early January. So yes, we're watching here from Israel, a bit disappointed and a bit concerned about the future of you know, Western alliance, Western values alliance, and of course we're used to being the ones being thrown under the bus of you know, different political agendas in Europe and the West in general. But I now look at the Iranian people, and I know that the phase where they're supposed to come out to the streets and change the future for them, for the region, for the world, is coming. And I'm concerned that, you know, such messages that are coming out from Europe, from other Arab states are maybe, you know, will reduce their motivation, feeling that like there is no international support for their efforts.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely understand the Israeli frustration in this regard. I think the one thing I would say that of course, it's below the radar and therefore people don't often comment on it, but the intelligence relationship between Britain and Israel, between Britain and the United States, and obviously between the United States and Israel, is exceptionally close. And that's partly because, as you know, the British and American intelligence are more or less joined at the hip. I mean, they're so close that they're almost impossible to separate. And so, you know, Israel was often referred to as being, you know, one of those extremely close partners. Now, of course, that sort of thing doesn't really create very much public comment because people don't know very much about it. It does matter though, and I think it tends to keep a fairly strong instinctive alignment of most British officials with Israeli objectives. And also, I mean, when you think about it, the way I usually phrase this when I'm talking to people is, you know, who exactly do you think are your friends in the region? Do you think that Iran, do you think the Islamic Republic is your friend? Do you think that Lebanese Hezbollah is your friend? Do you think the Houthis are your friend? And, you know, when people sort of look at it that way, they sort of, you know, ordinary people will say, oh yeah, okay, I see what you mean. You know, these guys hate us. They want to kill us. They shout from the rooftops that they're our enemies. Well, that means that our friends are Israel and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and, you know, countries that are actually a sort of reliable front line against these enemy states. But you make a really interesting point when you talk about the fate of ordinary Iranians, because I think for the first time I'm detecting in the context of the conflict that we've been seeing now for the last 2.5 years, really, since Israel was attacked on the 7th of October 2023. We are seeing where some of these Western countries, including the United Kingdom, partly because I think of demographics and because of the political calculations that I referred to earlier, you know, there is, at least in the public arena, there is some real questioning about who our friends are. And that is very troubling. Because what essentially you've got people out on the streets who've been supporting Hamas, supporting Hezbollah, supporting the Houthis, and now when we see a potential revolution in Iran, which I think most reasonable people and people of good faith would say that a change in Iran could be the greatest single good that could happen in the entire Middle East region. It's an absolute certainty that if Iran changes, it will change for the better. It simply can't change for the worse. It's possible it won't change, or it's possible it will collapse into chaos. There are all sorts of bad outcomes, but none of them are worse than the current situation, where you have a regime that means us harm and is seeking weapons of mass destruction with which to do us harm. So in those circumstances, for those same people who supported Hamas and Hezbollah to support the Islamic Republic, to oppose demonstrators who come out in favor of the liberation of the Iranian people from the Islamic Republic, that is really troubling. That suggests that a large slice of public opinion has gone really badly wrong.
Yes, I agree. That is a real concern. Okay, if you don't mind, let's dive into the region a little bit and try to make sense of our Arab neighbors around the region. So I want to start with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So look, we've been saying, the Americans have been saying for a while now that the Iranians have ballistic missiles and drones and other weapons that are, aimed at those countries. We know the historical rift. We know the posture of Arab states and the place of honor in their societies. And if you put all this together, especially if you think about, the current state of affairs, and one has to ask himself, what do you have to lose? You're already being attacked. We've said you will be attacked, and you are being attacked. Why not join, the coalition that is trying to defend you and trying to eliminate this threat once and for all? So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, can you shed some light on why they chose to basically sit on the fence with this issue?
I mean, I've been sort of studying this issue for a long time, and to some degree I've studied it with Israeli friends and colleagues as well, because of course you've been managing this for a very long time. People don't realize how far back Israeli relations go with the Gulf states, because intelligence relationships, they were kept under the radar. And one of the reasons that they were kept under the radar was because the Arab states were so extremely nervous about being accused of going soft on Israel or going soft on the Palestinian cause. In the case of the Saudis, one of the things that people forget sometimes is that they are endlessly criticized by the rest of the Islamic world as unworthy guardians of the holy places, of Mecca and Medina, the holy mosques. Now, it's an absurd accusation, of course. They actually do a very good job of that. They manage the Hajj remarkably well, although every time that there are casualties on the Hajj, the rest of the Islamic world is up in arms and saying, the Saudis do a bad job, they don't look after people, they don't care. And so they are very, very sensitive, even more than the other Arab states. They're terrified of being accused of, in some way betraying the Islamic world, I suppose is the main point. But Israel worked through that and developed increasingly strong load-bearing intelligence relations, counter-terrorism relations over many, many years. And then, of course, broke through with the Abraham Accords during the first Trump administration, when you suddenly had this sort of, the UAE effectively led, and I want to give full credit also to Morocco and Bahrain in that as well. Let's not give Sudan too much credit, since they're a complete basket case, of course.
It's a complete mess in Sudan.
No longer of any use, unfortunately. But the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and the Moroccans, they showed their independence of spirit. They showed their rationality, and they showed their commitment to prosperity and peace. Which is what you wouldn't have thought those were particularly controversial things, but nevertheless they were the trailblazers in this. And of course, we're all hoping that the Saudis will join, but the Saudis have been very slow, I think partly for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And then 7th of October happens, and 7th of October clearly sort of increases the nervousness of the Arab states. They worry about, to what extent do their populations tolerate what's happening in Gaza. And so, that put the Saudis off. I said to the Saudis at the time, I said, are you giving Hamas a veto on when you can normalize relations with Israel? Surely that doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't give a veto to a terrorist organization. And they sort of saw the point, but still, they just talk about when the time's right and all that. And they are very.
So what
cautious.
is the population saying about the fact that they're being bombarded, with impunity, basically, for the last almost 3 weeks now, and there is no response? What are you hearing?
Absolutely, bring it up to date as we must. So this, I think, is, if the 7th of October was one watershed, I think the 28th of February was another watershed, a new watershed. And it's definitely affected the mood in the Arab countries, dramatically affected the mood. Of course, the Emiratis, they had always managed a balancing act, which was, because they have a very strong sense of who they are and a very strong set of national strategies, they could be friends with Israel, but they could also be processing Iranian money and sort of maintaining relations with Iran. And now all of a sudden that's gone. The Iranians have attacked them in the most vicious and frankly would have done more if they could. It's only because Israel and the United States have done such a good job of suppressing the military threat from Iran that the Gulf states have not been attacked much worse than they have.
Right.
And so, the Emiratis are furious. And, I don't think they will ever go back to the level of understanding that they had, or the level of accommodation that they had with the Iranians before. The Iranians had done bad stuff in the Emirates before. They'd kidnapped, perfectly respectable visitors to the UAE.
Yeah, foreign diplomats, I believe, or foreign citizens at least, right? That visited.
Foreign citizens, yes.
Yeah.
And of course, sometimes those would be dual nationals, and the Iranians don't recognize dual nationality. But still, these would be really ghastly kidnapping operations on the streets of Dubai in broad daylight and things of that kind. Then you've got the other countries. Saudis, obviously, very angry as well. They've been attacked. They have much more strategic depth than the others. It's a bit less scary for them, although of course they've got these very vulnerable.
I think the UAE is leading the chart on the number of attacks on their soil from everyone else. Yeah.
Yes, the UAE has been attacked more than anybody else. But where it gets really interesting is countries that you would consider to have been rigorously neutral, like Qatar and Oman, have also been attacked. And this is really strange. Now, we saw some mixed communications coming out of Iran, which suggests to me that you had a sort of a pre-delegation of authority because they knew that they were going to be under military pressure. And it looks to me as if, command and control is rather loose now in Iran, and you've got IRGC units that are equipped to launch missiles and drones, but they to some degree they're autonomous in the way that they're functioning. And at one point, you may remember that the president tried to say, we won't attack countries if they don't attack us, but then that was immediately contradicted.
Yeah,
by
they're not listening to him, and I think they're in full control by right now.
Exactly so. I mean,
what is your sense
he's a
about
talking head.
What is your sense about the Saudis and the Emiratis? Are they going to change course, or they're going to remain, objective, I don't know, or at least on the fence for as long as they can? What is your sense?
Well, so the first thing that has happened is that the Iranians, by miscalculation or because they don't care, have fixed the disagreements that had arisen between the Saudis and the Emiratis. They're now, consulting with each other regularly. MBZ is talking to MBS. And so, the law of unintended consequences, the Iranians seem to imagine they can just lash out at people and it won't have any kind of blowback on them. But of course, it does have blowback. So the Arab states are now closer to each other than they've ever been. And Qatar is completely confused. They don't know what to do because, Hamas refuses to criticize the Iranians, but the Qataris are hosting Hamas. And the Qataris are being attacked by the Iranians. I saw that there was an article in Al Jazeera, I think either today or yesterday, which had a tone that was entirely different from any Al Jazeera reporting I'd seen before, which was actually, sort of basically saying that the Americans and the Israelis seem to be having a very successful military campaign.
Really?
Which is very much yeah, that's right. So you can see that these sort of pre-existing positions of the Qataris and of Al Jazeera are now really shaken by the fact that the Iranians have turned on them. The Omanis too, they're going to find this very difficult to manage. Now, at the moment, the Omanis are still playing nice with the Iranians. They're being very quiet and very tame. They haven't, for example, done one of the things that we've been asking for them to do, which is to take on the Houthi office in Muscat, because that office in Muscat, it's supposed to be a diplomatic liaison office. It's supposed to be there so that people can have peace talks with the Houthis. But actually that office has grown in size and it's become a large intelligence station. It's become a large procurement and smuggling station. And the Omanis are letting that happen, and they're letting it corrupt their society, because of course a lot of the smuggling from Iran to the Houthis is going across the land, across Omani territory, and Omanis are getting rich from it. So the Omanis need to be told, and I'm hoping that at some point the Americans will actually sort of sit down with them and say, look, you are valued partners, but some of the things that you have done are no longer acceptable. So that's something that needs to happen. Now, you're coming back to your main question, is has this changed for good? And I think the thing is that it's not going to be clear until we know the outcome of the war. And this is where the Arab calculations get quite complicated, because of course, if you're Saudi Arabia, you have mixed feelings about a renascent Persia. You actually would think, well, this is a country with massive natural resources, massive human resources, and if it gets back on its feet with international assistance and orientates itself towards prosperity and revival, then in some ways that's going to be, in some ways, a sort of a more daunting rival for us and make us less important in the region. Whereas if the Islamic Republic is severely damaged but just limps on for another 5 years or whatever it might be, on some level that's easier to manage. So I think you do, in parts of the Muslim world, you get that sort of mixed feeling about what they want. In the case of Turkey, I believe that Turkey absolutely wants the Islamic Republic to survive, because a weak Islamic Republic is exactly what they want. They don't care about the Iranian people. They care about their own power and the fact that, if the Iranians would then be supplicants to Turkey, and this is part of Turkey's vision of its imperial revival. The Pakistanis will also have mixed feelings. They may worry about bilateral relations and the Baluch separatist issue and things of that kind.
Yeah,
so
I think that there's another concern with Turkey, perhaps with Saudi Arabia as well, is that, if Israel comes out victorious, we look invincible. We all of a sudden look like we are a global power that cannot be stopped. And of course, Turkey wants to be that next global power that cannot be stopped. And I hear some voices from Saudi Arabia that are also expressing some concerns about how we grew in terms of our power and influence. So perhaps that's another factor in what you're saying, that they're kind of quietly rooting for the survival of a weak Islamic Republic and not for the victory of America and Israel in this war.
I think there's something in that. I think that Turkey is the one that is really worried about Israeli power, because they see themselves in direct opposition to you in so many arenas, and obviously primarily in Syria. I think with the Saudis, I think they're a bit more relaxed about Israel than the Turks are. But of course, Saudi Arabia is a big country. It's got a range of opinions that it holds. Even so, I think, one of the sort of tasks, I think, of diplomacy, and this is where the Americans perhaps need to do better, but they could also use some like-minded support. This again is an area where I would want Britain to be in a much more forward-leaning position, which would be talking to the Arab countries and saying, look, you need to draw some conclusions from this. One of them is that Israel is not your enemy. Iran is your enemy. That's obvious. And indeed, you may have seen Anwar Gargash of the UAE said exactly that today or yesterday. He actually said, it's not Israel who are attacking us with missiles, it's Iran. So if you ask me who's the threat, it's Iran. And I think that that's actually probably a mainstream opinion all the way up and down the Gulf. I think a lot of Kuwaitis would say the same thing. I know that a lot of Bahrainis would say the same thing. So we should be reinforcing those voices and also sort of planning for the day after. And it's partly about saying, that if the Islamic Republic falls and if the Iranian people are liberated, that is going to be good for the region. It's going to increase the sum total of trade and of wealth. And it's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, and stability. So there's a question that is on every Israeli mind since the beginning of this conflict, and it is, what is going on with the Houthis? Are we to expect them to, they've said a couple of days ago that they have made the decision to enter the war, but they haven't decided when. They're kind of, I don't know if that's true, or maybe it's just lip service to the Iranians. I mean, how do you know the Houthis pretty well? I mean, you had negotiations with them at the time. What is your view on this? I mean, why have they not joined so far? And do you think they are about to, and they're just waiting for the right moment?
Well, the first thing I would say about the Houthis is that of all of the Iranian proxies, I think they're the most independent-minded. And I think the Iranians historically have found them the hardest to corral. It's difficult to force them to do what they don't want to do or what they're not ready to do. And, it was very striking that last year during the 12-day war, of course, the Houthis were the proxy that came to the defense of the Islamic Republic. They were quite loud about supporting the Iranians in June last year. Now, why was that? I think it was partly because at that time you did not have a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. And of course, the Houthis had communicated again and again that they were supporting the Palestinian cause. That was their justification for attacking ships in the Red Sea. So that doesn't exist right now. You have a ceasefire which is continuing with Hamas. And therefore, the Houthis have to take a decision to do this purely in defense of the Islamic Republic. And I'm not sure they're ready to do that yet. They might do it, and they might look for a reason to do it. Something might happen that they said, okay, now that changes things, and now we're going to start attacking. But they have a number of problems, the Houthis. I mean, one is that they were hit quite badly last year, first by the Americans from March through May. You remember the 7-week war between the Americans and the Houthis. And the Americans were kind of no holds barred at that time, and they did a lot of damage to Houthi infrastructure and to Houthi command and control. And then, of course, Israel carried out one of those decapitation masterstrokes on the 28th of August. And we still don't have the full battle damage assessment from the 28th of August because the Houthis hid who had been killed, but they were knocked sideways by that attack. I know Mehdi Mashat personally because I have negotiated with him. I've sat in rooms with him, perhaps the most unpleasant person I've ever sat in a room with in my life. And after that Israeli attack on the 28th of August, the Houthis went radio silent for 24 hours. They couldn't react. They didn't do or say anything. And it was only after 24 hours and more that Mehdi Mashat finally appeared on the media and sort of gave some kind of version of events. But of course, by then, they'd obviously decided they couldn't afford to admit how many key Houthis had been killed in that strike. And so those details have been bleeding out ever since. In September, October, November, there have been sudden recognitions that some leading Houthi has died. And when you study it, you realize that person had gone completely silent ever since the 28th of August. So I think the Houthis are struggling. They're struggling with resupply as well, because how can the Iranians resupply them at the moment? The Iranians are absolutely under the cosh. They don't have any spare capacity to resupply. And even after the June war, there was an element of resupply. Some of it was being intercepted by the internationally recognized government of Yemen. Some of it, I'm sure, was getting through as well. But this was one battered country trying to supply another battered militia. And so not on the level that we were seeing prior to 2025. So in my view, the Houthis are still dangerous. They still will attack Israel at some point. They definitely want to do that. It's part of their mission statement. As you know, they have this scream, which includes death to Israel as well as death to America. So it's really a matter of timing, but they would prefer to pick the timing. They'd prefer to be ready because they also know that their ability to hurt Israel is very, very limited. Occasionally, they'll be able to get a drone or a missile through your defenses, but very occasionally. Every time they do it, Israel is able to, just completely take out the port structure of Hodeidah.
Yeah. By the way, you mentioned the possible positive outcome of this war, which is the reconnecting between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and we've seen them hash it out on the Yemen issue, and we see the international recognized government that is backed by the Saudis, kind of kick out or even fire upon forces that are supported by the UAE. Are you seeing any, changes for the good on the Yemenis front as well? Does that create a new problem or a renewed problem for the Houthis on that front?
I'm not seeing any renewed problem for the Houthis there. I mean, they're fighting a civil war. The battle lines of the civil war are largely frozen. I mean, the Houthis have not made significant progress in the civil war for some years now, and so. Meanwhile, the internationally recognized government was revealed, obviously, late last year as being very divided, and you had this sort of, this sudden explosion of southern separatism, which was always present, but the Southerners had been had been accepting that they were going to play nice within the IRG. I think the Saudi reaction to that, although the Saudis got a lot of criticism, my main criticism of the Saudis was I think they were unnecessarily harsh on the Emiratis about it. I think they should have recognized that the Emiratis apologized afterwards and said, look, we were not trying to create a problem for Saudi Arabia, and we will not do anything more because we understand how you feel about it now. I think the Saudis should have been a bit more graceful at the time, but of course the Iranian attacks have now papered over those cracks. But of course, what the Saudis did was that they sort of revived the internationally recognized government, and they turned the actual leader of the Southern Transitional Council into a fugitive, and actually things have slightly settled down, but I don't think that the Yemeni government forces are going to make much progress in present circumstances. I think all they can do really is just hold their lines. So I think the Houthis are still going to be a problem, and this is interesting actually, of course. In the case of the Iranian war, what will that mean for the Houthis afterwards? Well, of course, if you have a sort of a battered but still intact Islamic Republic with the Revolutionary Guards in control and sort of trying to recover from having lost these huge military losses and infrastructural losses that they've had, then they will obviously see the Houthis as one of the arms that they can use to revive their threat. So I think we need to worry about that as a prospect if we don't see a regime change in Iran.
Yeah.
But of course, if we do see regime change in Iran, if we actually end up with a new post-Islamic Republic Iran, even though it may struggle, there'll be a lot of things that will be difficult initially while it tries to recover from just the sheer sort of devastation that the Islamic Republic will have left it. Nevertheless, that cuts off the supply line to the Houthis. And the Houthis, I think, will then be in a much weaker position in the civil war in Yemen. And then, because at some point the Houthis will have to be part of a negotiation process in Yemen. There will have to be a peace in Yemen which reflects the interests of all of the communities in the country. Now, the Houthis are only a small community. They don't deserve outsized weight in that. But at some point, you do need to get back into a sort of a national dialogue in Yemen about how it's going to be governed in the future. And if that can be done after the fall of the Islamic Republic, then there is a chance that you end up with some kind of constructive outcome in Yemen.
Yeah, I hope so. Let me ask you another question. I mean, I have Bahrain in mind. Like, Bahrain has a majority of Shiite community, right? I heard some voices from people in Bahrain possibly supporting Iran in this conflict. Do you see anything, any trends that can be of real concern to the Bahraini, to Bahrain as it is currently governed, or do you think it's just, a minority of voices?
I think it's a minority of voices. I mean, the fact of all the Gulf Shia, and remember there are significant Shia population in Kuwait as well, in Saudi Arabia as well, in the UAE as well. You've got these Shia who are of two different types, effectively. People who are long established and deeply patriotic and loyal to their governments, and then in some cases more recent, but not in all cases, just people who have become ideological zealots for the Iranian Revolution. And the gulf between those two types of Shiite is massive. I remember it when I served in Kuwait for 3 years. You had Kuwaiti Hezbollah, and those people were absolutely, just cat's paws of the Revolutionary Guards. But you also had, a large patriotic population of long-established Kuwaiti Shia who were completely loyal to the Al-Sabah, to the government of Kuwait. So I think in Bahrain, the reason it's different is, as you say, the Shia are the majority population in Bahrain. The Sunni are the minority. Obviously, the ruling family, the monarchy, is from the Sunni minority. Now, in my view, the great majority of Bahraini Shia are loyal Bahraini citizens, but you have got a large community of fellow travelers with Iran, a large community of IRGC agents and assets. And of course, you've got things like Lua Lua TV in London, masquerading as a Bahraini sort of opposition TV station, but actually, essentially a tool of the Iranian regime as well. And so I think these people will make as much trouble as they can. And certainly if I were the Bahrainis, I'd worry about the terrorist threat. I would worry that there are people there, sleepers in Bahrain, who mean them harm. And if they got the chance to, blow up a hotel or kill a member of the royal family, I'm sure they would do so. Whether they've got the capability, though, that's another matter. One of the striking things about all of the Gulf Hezbollah groups was that they were aging a bit. They were losing their mojo on some level. And so whether these people have got the real fire in their belly that they're ready to sort of take to the streets and start killing compatriots, especially in a cause that may be losing, because this is the other question that people have got in their minds is Iran losing? And if Iran's losing, where does that leave me?
Right, exactly. So that leads me to, I think, one of the most interesting arenas in this war, which is Iraq. I mean, Iraq is this is bizarre. It's so complex. I think most people don't understand. I mean, this government is you can say a pro-Iranian government at least in the foundations of it. But also Iraq has kind of developed into its own. They have a national identity that they've kind of never had before. There are also a lot of Iraqis, either Shiite or others, of course, that are, supportive of independence. They don't want to be dragged into this, but, the Iranians are firing to Iraq, firing on the Kurds, firing on other targets. What can you make sense of this? I mean, where is this going?
I mean, there's some things in common, aren't there, between Iraq and Lebanon? You've got in Iraq you have essentially three communities, three significant communities. The Kurds, the Sunni Arabs, and then the Shia Arabs. And the Shia Arabs are the largest of those three communities. So once again, you've got this same division between Iraqi patriots who are Shia and cat's paws of the Iranians, Iranian agents. And of course, the worst of the Iranian agents are these proxy militias. I won't even go into their names, but you'll be very familiar with all of them, Kataib Hezbollah, etc. I remember writing a paper on these, and sort of, I kept coming across new ones. The more I wrote, the more I realized there were more of these militias.
Yeah, it's like we said about Syria at the time. We stopped counting at 100 militias. It's like, okay, it's getting boring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
and we put them on a sort of a red, amber, green, where the red was sort of completely an agent of the Iranian government, and Amber was partially loyal to Baghdad and partially to to Iran. And most of them were either red or amber, and in fact the greater number were red rather than amber.
Wow.
So these are really bad people. These are people who, and also with a lot of American blood on their hands, because these people were sort of killing Americans really almost from the very beginning after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But what tends to happen is that if you rise to become a serious contender to become prime minister in Iraq, and it's the prime minister's position that is always given to a Shia Arab, because they have a deliberate, this sort of deliberate diversity, that the president and the speaker will be from the other communities. But the prime minister, who is the single most important figure in Iraq, will come from the Iraqi Shia. And generally speaking, the Iraqi prime ministers have been quite reasonable people, and they have understood that Iraq has a number of partnerships. And whilst they don't seek to alienate Iran, or they didn't used to seek to alienate Iran, they also depended a great deal on their relationship with the United States and with the other Arab countries. And so these prime ministers would sort of keep the militias at bay. They would sort of manage a balancing act. Now, Nouri al-Maliki, probably the worst prime minister that Iraq has had, the worst post-Saddam leader that Iraq has had, is a possible candidate to lead Iraq. And I have no faith in him at all. I think he is somebody who is capable of doing great damage to Iraq, because he will be kowtowing to the militias and kowtowing to Tehran. And so that is concerning.
Is he an ideologue at all, you think?
I don't know if he's an ideologue. He seems to me to be a very cynical and opportunist person. He's also a very bitter person. There was a lot of malice that he seemed to have towards the West, in spite of the fact that that he owed his whole position to the United States. But sometimes that happens, doesn't it? People actually sort of get really sort of angry and sort of insecure about a country that has helped you to achieve what you were trying to achieve. Anyway, I think the point here is that the Americans need to manage this quite carefully. They need to put a lot of diplomatic pressure on the Iraqis and say, look, if you call this wrong, if you effectively empower militias who are currently trying to kill our personnel, as they are currently trying to kill US personnel, then we will regard that as a hostile act. And of course, the Americans have taken kinetic action against the militias in Iraq, and I don't know whether Israel's been involved in those operations, but certainly the Americans have done it. So I think that the Iraqis will be very careful. They will know, again, that same question arises, doesn't it? Which is the Islamic Republic going to survive? And do I actually want to back that horse if that horse is going to lose? So the Iraqis, I think, will try to produce some kind of safe political outcome that enables them to wait out the conflict and see what things look like afterwards.
I understand. Okay, final question, if you don't mind. I'm very, very curious about Azerbaijan. Okay, Azerbaijan is fascinating to us because it's a Muslim Shia country that is a very, very good friend of Israel. And they've been attacked now, not a lot, but they still have been attacked by Iran. They've been angry about it, expressed anger about it, but haven't really done anything actively. So what do you think? I mean, why did Iran attack them, and where do you think it's going?
Well, I mean, yeah, it was another one of those crazy bits of lashing out, wasn't it? And you thought, well, fine, if you want to do that, if you want to make the whole world your enemy, if you want to give Israel and America new allies, be my guest, Now, Azerbaijan, as you said, great relationship with Israel. The Iranians know that, and there will be IRGC hardliners who really resent it. And as you will recall, the previous president of Iran died in a helicopter crash after he had been on the Iranian Azerbaijan border, coming back from Azerbaijan. And there may be residual suspicions amongst the IRGC that Azerbaijan was somehow or other complicit in that, because of course that guy, that was a really important death, because he would have been the successor to Khamenei when Khamenei was killed, and it was his death which meant that the Iranians didn't have a credible successor to Khamenei, and you end up with Khamenei Jr., and cardboard cutouts of him and all the rest of it, and which is a disastrous look for the Islamic Republic. So it may be that people in the IRGC still resent the Azeris for that. Now, from Azerbaijan's point of view, they've got a very complicated set of cards to play. They obviously have severe concerns about the Iranians. They also are very aware that there's a large Azeri community in Iran, and that that gives them a sort of the same kind of ambivalent feeling about Iran that the Tajiks have about Afghanistan, because you've got all these Afghan Tajiks, and that has dynamics which can move both ways across the border. Also, the Azeris have this very complicated hand to play in consolidating their victory over Armenia, which they've done that pretty well, but it's still not straightforward. They have horribly complicated borders with Armenia, and then of course Russia is in the background as another complicating factor. The Russians must be the worst ally that anyone's ever had. Ask any Iranian, ask any Armenian, ask any Syrian. And Russia is completely useless as an ally. They basically never do anything when their friends are attacked. So there's this oddity that Azerbaijan and Armenia, they're both sort of former Soviet republics. They have to take Russia seriously, but Russia is not a useful player in either for either of them, frankly. The Azeris also have to maintain relations with Turkey. So it's the Azeris also traditionally have really good relations with the West, and there's been an awful lot of Western oil engagement in Baku. So it's an interesting and sophisticated country that's very experienced in managing this complicated set of cards that it has to play. But Iran attacked them, and I think they will feel absolutely justified in supporting anyone who is a combatant against Iran.
Yeah, I hope to see them join us. I mean, they are great people and are very experienced fighters. And I met a lot of Azeri leaders, and I was very, very impressed. They have a sense of self that is very inspiring, and for us as Israelis, it feels like a real camaraderie between the two nations.
It's a wonderful thing, and I'm so glad that Israel has those kind of relations, and I think you've cultivated them with enormous skill over the years. And of course, when people were talking about an international stabilization force for Gaza, and for obvious reasons, people said, well, you certainly can't have Turkey. That's unacceptable. But you do end up thinking about people like the Azeris, because, as you say, they're excellent fighters, and they would also do an honest, good faith job as peacekeepers.
Yeah, I hope so. Edmund, anything you want to add that I forgot to ask, or anything at all?
Well, I mean, we haven't mentioned Syria, and we probably don't need to go into much detail about it, because whatever the difficulties with Syria, and they are big, they're not really over Iran. The fact is that, whatever your view of, interim President Shara, I think his hatred of Iran is greater than his hatred of anybody else.
Of Iran and Hezbollah also, by the way. I mean, I think they hate them more than we hate them, which is crazy. Exactly
so, and this is really, this is incredibly helpful in terms of managing this conflict. That the Iranians and Lebanese Hezbollah have got no help from Syria, so that's a good thing. I guess the main thing I would just mention, that's worth mentioning, is, I think this is a historic opportunity, and Israel has created it to a very large extent, because let's face it, it's not just it's obviously an American military campaign as well, but it's a very even one. It seems to me that it's roughly a 50-50 military campaign between the US and Israel, which is an extraordinary tribute to Israel's fighting capability, and of course Israel's intelligence capability, which is perhaps the biggest single story of the last 2.5 years. So one of the things that is frustrating in the West is how quickly people say that a war is dragging on. and they've said this about this war. It's dragging on. There's no end in sight. We're not even 3 weeks in. And, at the beginning of the war, the Americans said, well, this could easily take 4 weeks or, it could be longer. Now, people are still talking about a span of weeks, not months. They're still saying, that probably this can be fully achieved within another, let's say, 3 weeks or something of the kind. That's a price worth paying, even if it's high, even if it means high oil prices, even if it means an enhanced terrorist threat in some places. If at the end of this, the Americans and the Israelis stay the course and Iran is transformed for the better, everybody benefits. The whole Arab world, whole Europe.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, look, we live in a society where you have a, you have a computer in your hand, your cell phone all the time, and if something doesn't upload in 2-3 seconds, you get furious. I mean, that's how, the attention span has really declined to zero, I think, in Western society. So to make a historical change in the Middle East, in the world, to turn the worst actor into maybe the best friend of the West, and you expect it to take a couple of days. That's just insane. The Israelis believe it. We run to shelters. It's very difficult, but we are very optimistic. We're very hopeful, and I have to say we're very grateful to have friends like you. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much. Toda rabba. And Edmund, I hope to speak to you soon, and I hope to call you when we finish this and congratulate each other and maybe crack open a bottle of champagne.
I look forward to that very much. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Edmund. Bye-bye.
Oh, and please send me a link as soon as you publish it.
Of course, we'll send you.
Wonderful. Bye for now.
Bye, toda.